Hi, everybody. Welcome to this edition of the Broomfield Chamber of Commerce Education Series. I'm Pat Monticelli with the Broomfield Chamber. We've done a lot of different topics over the course of this education series, and we have a great one today. We're going to talk about tackling your debt. Debt is it seems to be always a topic, but especially nowadays when people are facing challenges in the workforce because of income or lack of income or having to dip into savings or things like that. So it's very important for us to talk about how to manage debt, how to make it through these times, and really set yourself up to be able to manage debt in a positive way. Heather Venechuk from Millennial Wealth Management is joining us. She'll be presenting today. I also want to mention the Broomfield Enterprise. Thank them for their sponsorship of our webinars. They are our webinar partner for the Broomfield Chamber Education Series. The Broomfield Enterprise is a chamber member and has been a huge supporter for many, many years. We thank them for everything that they do for the chamber. So with that, I'm going to introduce Heather, and Heather is going to present again on tackling your debt. So Heather, tell us a little bit about you, and let's hit the ground running.
Yeah, so real quick, I'm the Director of Education at Millennial Wealth Management. So my goal is to teach as many people about basic financial information as possible. So I'm so excited to be here and to be talking about tackling debt. I'm going to share my screen here momentarily, and we can get rolling with this particular topic. And I was here a couple of weeks ago speaking for the chamber through one of these webinars about some of the more current event topics, like how to manage your finances through these uncertain times. And I think today will tie in really nicely with some of those topics. So if you haven't checked that out, I know they post these webinars and you can access them after the fact. So definitely worth checking that out as well. But let's dive in.
Great.
So, and I want to say, Pat, feel free, hop in, ask questions. Any of you who are out there, feel free to post things in the chat. But I am happy to pause at any time and answer questions as we go along. So it makes it a lot more tangible the more examples that we have. So I always love to include that in my talks. So let's start off by talking about different types of debt. Not all debt is necessarily created equal or is considered equal. There are some different kinds of debt that have different properties and serve different purposes. So I want to start by breaking that down a little bit. Debt tends to have a negative connotation, and that can be the case, but it's not necessarily that straightforward. So we think about good debt as debt that's providing some kind of value that helps you build wealth in the long term. So education debt is a great example of this, right? Because if you go to school, hopefully it's helping you build on your career, and that way you could potentially earn a higher income, building wealth in the long term. Mortgage or real estate debt also kind of falls under that, right? Hopefully you're purchasing a property that's going to earn value over time and continue to grow and be one of the many assets that you consider within your big financial portfolio, right? Bad debt is debt that doesn't really serve that purpose, right? It's not helping you build wealth in the long term. So really its purpose is more helping you cover when you're short for a month, or basically spending money that you don't necessarily have now. So like credit card debt or auto loans, or even a lease falls under this category, payday lending, family loans, personal loans, all of those things we call bad debt because, again, they're not helping you build wealth in the long term. They're just to kind of hold you over until you can build up enough income or enough cash to cover that expense on your own. So we really want to only focus on if we have to take on debt, taking on debt that helps us build wealth in the long term. We really want to avoid, if at all possible, any kind of bad debt or debt that doesn't help us build wealth. Now, regardless of whether it's good or bad, doesn't necessarily mean that's not the determining factor of whether or not you want to pay it off. We're going to talk about how we can approach that here in a minute. But keep that in mind, right? You can want to pay your educational loans off. If you went to school and got student debt, if you want to pay that off, that's a great thing. And even though it's good debt, you can still have that desire, and we can still work toward that goal. But I do like to throw that out there as kind of a good philosophy for you to use as you go through your life and are considering taking on debt for any particular purchase. So the process to get out of debt is relatively simple from the high level. We're going to break it down into more detail and kind of help you figure out how you could create a plan for yourself. So first is to know what you have, understanding the big picture of what debt you have. Optimizing rates, we'll talk about why that's really important. That's a very critical step. And it's going to be an important step to determining whether or not you want to pay something off. I know that's a common question that I get. To set a goal, to choose a debt strategy. So we'll walk through what some of those different strategies look like here today. And then to review and monitor, everything changes as we go along. So let's break that down a little bit more. First, you have to know what you have. It's really hard to pay things off if you don't know exactly what you have to pay off. And there's a couple of things that you're really going to want to look for and focus on. So this is a great activity to do. Set aside some time, pull out all your financial documents. This isn't exactly riveting and fun, but it's something that's really, really important before you dive in and make a commitment to getting out of debt. You're looking for a handful of really important things on these financial documents. You're looking for the minimum amount due per month, right? So not always what you're paying, but really what the minimum amount due is. So for example, if you have a credit card, maybe you pay $400 a month on it, but maybe the minimum payment is $25. That's the kind of information that we're looking for. The interest rate. This is extremely important. This is really the determining factor of what order you're going to pay debt off in and whether or not you want to pay off debt in the first place. Often when we talk about paying off debt, we kind of set the mortgage debt aside, and that's because it's good debt, first of all, right? But also because recently mortgages have had relatively low interest rates, and that is one of the main things that you can use to determine whether or not you want to pay something off and how quickly you want to pay it off. Our rule of thumb, and again, this depends on your desires and goals and personality and opinions on debt, but we usually say if it's under 5%, it's not super urgent to pay it off. You don't even necessarily have to pay it off early. If it's over 5%, we're trying to set it as a priority and tackle that debt. So that's going to be critical. And we're also going to I'll talk about some strategies again here in a little bit, but the interest rate will come in handy then as well. The total balance, so exactly what you owe still. And then any available credit you have that's left over. An example of this, might be if you have a credit card, what is your credit limit? If you have the opportunity to pursue lines off your mortgage, stuff like that. Those are important things to know. We'll talk about that a little bit more when we get to discussing debt consolidation here in a little bit. But those are all the things you really need to know in order to make a very well-educated decision and move forward through this as effectively as possible. I will say if you have student loans, very important that you go through this kind of with a fine-tooth comb. Student loans tend to be split into smaller chunks. So you may think, oh, I have $40,000 of student loan debt, but really it's $5,000 here, $10,000 here, $1,000 here, and they could all have different interest rates. So very important that you look into that and see exactly what those are, what the balances due in each section is, and what the interest rate is for each of those. So we talked about how we want to pay any debt off that's over 5%, right? And if we're paying off debt that's over 5%, we want to think about how we can get creative about doing that, right? The interest rate that you pay on debt is money that you're paying on top of what you already owe, right? So for example, if you're paying off a car, the interest rate on that car, you're paying in addition to whatever the principal amount was. This makes it kind of hard to get out of debt, especially if that interest rate is really high. So we want to try and get creative if we're really committed to getting out of debt, setting ourselves up in a position where it's very easy to work with a lower interest rate so that we can get out of debt faster. There's a couple of ways that you could do this. You can consider consolidating debt. a really common, or one of the common ways of doing this is taking a variety, if you have a handful of different debts and wrapping it into a home equity loan. Sometimes that works. The other option that is perhaps even more common is credit card hacking, right? If you get a 0% credit card, wrap all your debt onto that credit card and pay it off within that 0% time period, that's a great way to start tackling some of that debt while keeping or preventing any interest from accumulating during that time. This year was really interesting because, of course, we saw that student loans, if they're federal student loans, they had a little bit of leniency here. So this is a great example of, okay, those loans right now are at 0%. How can we shift our mindset and approach debt a little bit differently knowing that? It was a kind of unique scenario and a great opportunity if you're hoping to get out of debt to take advantage of that. You have a question?
Can I jump in with a question?
Yeah.
And so when we're talking about optimizing rates, there are people who have a lot of credit card debt, and you know how those credit card works. Credit cards, it's not uncommon for credit cards to be in that anywhere from that 13 to 24% interest range. Is it best to try to put all of that on a lower balance card, or to work through a bank and try to get a loan from the bank that's a lower interest rate to pay off all of that debt and then pay your bank back? Is there a preferred method there?
So, and it depends is kind of the short answer, but I'll kind of clarify what the two different options here are. If you think that you can tackle it in the time of, so, for example, with those 0% credit cards, there's usually like a time frame that the 0% is active, right? So you have to pay it off within 12 to 18 months is pretty standard. If you can pull that off, I would go credit card for sure. The other caveat to that is, of course, you have to make sure that you have a credit score good enough to get one of these cards and that the credit limit is high enough to pull that balance over. But generally speaking, that's the ideal because there's no interest rate, right? So if we can get you completely out of debt with no interest being paid, that's an awesome scenario. If not, going to a bank is an option. It's kind of an interest rate game, right? So we want to see, is it cheaper? What kind of loans are they offering? What interest rates are they at? If you know it's going to take you more than 12 or 18 months and there's just no way that you can possibly set aside a large enough chunk of money per month to do that, that is an option. But ideally, if it's a priority for you, we're talking about setting aside every spare dollar every month and putting all of that into paying off a zero balance card. Yeah.
And to kind of a follow-up question to that, the part of that process, of that consolidation loan process, is that once you make an inquiry, you suddenly get a load of messages from credit card consolidation companies and offers to consolidate debt. But it seems to me that sometimes the interest rates on those consolidation loans are almost as high as the rates that you're trying to get out from under.
Yes.
Is that what you see?
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say, is that a realistic analogy? Is that what we see out there?
Yeah, that's not uncommon, and that's why I put that on this slide kind of with the caveat of like credit card hacking is kind of the more common method. It depends. I mean, there can be pretty good rates for consolidation, or they can be relatively high. It depends on a whole variety of factors, from your credit score, how much debt you have, to just the interest rates in the economy as a whole. But yes, they can be high. And to that point, if you're finding that, if you consolidate and it's going to be at 7% and your student loan or fill in the blank other loan is at 6%, well, there's no point in doing that, right? If you're, like you mentioned, credit cards right now, the like national average for a credit card interest rate is 19.02%, really, really high. And I mean, I can speak from experience. They're exceptionally high. Those are definitely the tough ones. Then you might find that it's lower, right? Ideally, but again, if you can move it to a zero balance card, even if it's just that chunk, right, that super high interest piece of your overall debt, that might help you be more successful in the long run. So of course, it's awesome to be debt-free, right? Not having that payment every month is very freeing, right? It's a really, really good feeling, and that's what we want to work toward. So there's kind of two ways that you can approach this. You can either start by saying, I really want to be debt-free by blank day. Is it 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, a couple of months? You know, we just talked about those 0% credit cards and the time frame for those being roughly between 12 and 18 months. Is that the goal? Just kind of setting that date that you really want to have that completed by. Or you can go from the other direction, which is how much money do you have per month that you could realistically set aside? Right, so the other way, we're picking the date and then doing the math backwards to see how much it is per month. This way, we're saying, okay, this is how much we can realistically contribute, and how far out does that go? The trick here is to set a goal and be consistent with it, right? We want to constantly be on top of it, making sure we're meeting this goal, tell somebody about it, make sure you're consistent with it. If we're not sticking to it, we're not going to pay it off, right? But if you have a very specific deadline and you know, okay, I want to be out of debt in 5 years. If I don't set aside this much this month, that goal is not going to happen. That really holds you accountable and makes it a lot easier. When we talk about goal setting, everyone talks about setting SMART goals. So specific, measurable, actionable, right? Forgetting what R and T are, but you get the idea, right? Setting a very specific date and having a very good outline of what you're going to do. All right, let's talk about strategy. So there's two kind of major strategies that people often hear about when we talk about debt. The first is a snowball strategy. This is frankly the most common one that people hear about because it feels really good. You start by paying off the smallest debt first, and then you build to the bigger debts. So for example, if you have a $200 credit card debt, a $5,000 car loan, and then a $40,000 student loan, you're starting with a credit card. It's awesome because you're probably going to tackle that first piece of your debt pretty quickly, and it's going to feel great, right? So it's very motivating, it feels good, you're getting through it, you're making moves. But it's not monetarily most efficient. And this is where, as advisors, we actually are going to talk about the Avalanche method, because financially it's going to set you up to be better off. And I'll explain what that means here in a minute. But through this strategy, you could potentially end up paying more interest in the long run because you're just starting on size of loan, not necessarily by interest rate. So on that note, we're a big fan of the Avalanche strategy. And this strategy says pay off the loan with the highest interest rate first, and then work your way down to the lowest interest rate. So credit card debt usually falls on top of that pile. And then a car or student loan, depending on what the interest rate is, could be somewhere in the middle. And that's why it was really important that you gathered all that information right at the start, because you have all those different interest rates outlined now. You know exactly what they are. And so you can say, okay, this is the highest. I'm going to start with that one and work my way to the lowest. That being said, the con of this one is you might be starting with the biggest chunk of your debt, and that can be a tough sell. It cannot feel very good, right? If you've got $20,000 in credit card debt and that's the most debt that you have, well, that's not, it's going to take some time to work toward. But despite it being a little bit less motivating, it's definitely the most monetarily efficient. And it's going to make it easiest for you to get out of debt because you're saving yourself money and preventing yourself from paying more interest than you need to. You can then take that money and put it into getting out of debt, right? So it goes much quicker, which is why it's called that Avalanche method, right? Really picks up speed as it goes. So this is definitely our suggestion, but of course, both of those, as long as you're picking a strategy and sticking with it, and making a commitment to it, obviously that's the most important thing. But this is definitely the ideal. And then finally, we're going to review and monitor. So when you outline a payment strategy, we have to keep thinking, is this the best one? Is this still the right move? For example, if you were trying to get out of student loan debt this year because you had a relatively high interest rate on your student loan debt and they were federal student loans, well, you may have realigned your strategy when you realize that your loans weren't going to accumulate interest for a portion of this year, right? So we want to be thoughtful about that and constantly be adjusting. This year was really unusual. That normally doesn't happen, but we still want to be flexible and be thinking about what options exist and how we can pivot accordingly. Consolidation may also not be the right move in 1 minute, but could look very different in a year or so, right? We talked a little bit earlier about there's a handful of things that impact making consolidation worth it, from the interest rates to your personal credit score to your overall debt, and all of those things shift over time, right? So while it may not make sense right now, or you couldn't get a 0% credit card right now, that could look really different in even 6 months to a year. So we're doing the best with what we can in the moment and shifting as things hopefully improve. And then we can continue to be as strategic as possible. Also be thinking about, is there anything more you can do to save per month? And this is where, if we talked a little bit about budgeting in our last session, but if you're keeping a good budget, if you're aware of how much money you're spending, you can hopefully be really thoughtful that you're using your money as efficiently as possible. And if you have any extra money, it's going toward debt, right? We usually suggest, before seriously investing, you really want to be focusing on debt. Before buying lots of new things, we want to really be focusing on debt. The only thing that even comes before debt is just having a small emergency fund when we think about the overall progression of working towards wealth. So it's very important to start with this debt and put it as your #1 priority and make that commitment to it. And then that final question there, if I contributed $100 or $200 or even $500 more a month, how would that impact how long it takes me to get out of debt, right? That can have a huge difference. And if you have a little bit extra every month, what change can that have in the long term? Running that math and seeing how much quicker you could get out of debt is pretty motivating a lot of the time. So it's great to run those numbers and kind of see what that could potentially look like. This is some of my favorite work to do with clients, because usually it starts with the idea that they can never be debt-free and ends up with having a very specific day and month that they will be out of debt, which can feel really good and feel pretty life-changing. So, all right. And then there's 5 other things I wanted to talk about as just some general tips for success, aside from the process. So now you know if you're in debt and you want to get out of it, kind of how you can work through that. But there are some external factors that can play a big role in you being successful in getting out of debt. So first is to have a budget, right? I mentioned this briefly in the last slide, but if you aren't keeping track of your expenses, you're probably spending more than you need to. I'm guilty of this personally. The first time I ever set up a budget, I was like, oh, wow, this is exactly how much these things realistically cost. And it really made it much clearer of how to commit to that. It helps you live beneath your means, right? We, by nature, spend more because it feels good, right? We want these luxuries of life. If we set a budget and a goal for ourselves, it's a lot easier to commit to saving more per month. The big ones, and this year was probably weird for everyone, but they tend to be eating out, entertainment, and Amazon. So think about those buckets, how you're doing in those particular buckets and how you might be able to improve. It's amazing how much those things can add up, and they kind of sneak up on us because it's so easy to just order something off Amazon and have it be here in a couple of days, or just order out instead of cooking, right? So there's a couple of lifestyle changes that make a big difference there. Of course, the other big thing is to keep in mind every time you make a big purchase, is it really essential? Do you really need a new car? Do you even really need 2 cars? can speak from experience. Right now, our household really only needs one, but we are going to hold on to that second car. But those are kind of the conversations that you can have and work toward what is really critical. Do we need a TV in that room and that room? Could we just have one in a single room? That kind of thing. Every dollar you save is one more dollar that you can use to pay off debt, and one more dollar that hopefully works toward changing your life and helping you build wealth in the long term. Second one on here is to not use credit. If you already have credit cards or credit card debt, or even you're just working to get out of other kinds of debt, try to not use credit cards and try to not accumulate any more debt on them. It's really, this tends to be the one spot where people get kind of caught in a vicious cycle. They, as we mentioned earlier, have the highest interest rates of any form of money. So while it can be great to take advantage of a 0% card, we want to be really thoughtful about when that 0% time ends, because you don't want money on that credit card at that point. It's going to bounce back up to 18, 20, 30% overnight, right? And that obviously makes it a lot more challenging to pay off. It's, you know, obviously one of the most challenging things that you can do to yourself as you're trying to get out of debt. They create, credit cards for all of us, create this false sense of security, right? We think that we have money to spend, even if we don't necessarily have it in the bank. And by the way, if you're keeping a budget, I highly suggest you keep track of expenses as they're spent, not necessarily like at the end of the month when you're trying to pay your bill. Because again, it creates that false sense of security. Oh, I've got money in the bank, so it's okay. But right up until you pay that bill, right? And that's where it can be more complicated. Obviously, credit cards do have some benefits, and we generally are pro credit card, so to speak. I think, you know, they have some great benefits like cash back, travel rewards, things like that. But if you're struggling with them and you have a lot of credit card debt, it might just be time to take a break, and that's okay. You can keep accounts open and hide the cards from yourself if you want to preserve your credit score, things like that. But you don't necessarily have to use them. And avoiding using them can really make a difference in preventing that temptation to overspend month over month. Third one on here is have an emergency fund. So this one we mentioned really briefly again in our last session, but this is a really important thing to have in general. But the big takeaway here, and the big reason why I mention it now, is that if you have a solid emergency fund, it's going to help you not put things on a credit card, right? So when you're trying to get out of debt, we suggest you have at least $1,000 in an emergency fund, because if something comes up, which it inevitably does, you don't have to immediately throw that on a credit card and have set yourself back that amount in your journey to get out of debt. So start with that little nest egg. If you can, you know, have more tucked away, that's great, but it is kind of a balance between wanting to have some in an emergency fund and then wanting to use that cash to get out of debt, right? So we usually say start pretty small. And then let's see, consider selling things. This sounds really silly, but it's actually, it makes a really huge difference, right? And the mindset here, or the questions to be asking yourself are, what can you live without in order to resolve your debt, right? Do you need a car, or do you need more than one car in your household? Oftentimes you can get away with working with less, right? So how can you pare back to what you truly just need? And we have to keep in mind that this isn't a permanent, it's not a permanent condition, right? You will eventually one day be out of debt, and we don't have to be trying to think about how to sell all these things or live as minimally as possible. But when we're trying to get out of debt, it's a great mindset to have, and it can speed up the process very significantly. The other option there is, you know, if you're not selling it, could you use it for another purpose? Like, you know, if you've got a spare room in your house, could you consider Airbnb or renting a car? I realize that this year in particular, that's a lot more challenging, but generally speaking, that is something that you could kind of consider to get more out of these assets if you want or have to keep them. The basic gist of this is that things are really expensive, right? It's not just the value of the thing that you spend, it's also the cost to store it, to insure it, to keep it maintenance, keep it clean. And those things add up and make items a lot more expensive than just the price you paid to acquire them. So if you can think about how you can sell things, how you can get rid of some of the excess, it'll help you save in the long term. And then the final point on here is to consider a side gig. When we talk about finances, building wealth, getting out of debt, anything along those lines, your income is the #1 factor in your success, frankly. The more income you have, the greater likelihood you have of paying things off, investing, saving, all of these kinds of activities, right? You've just got more cash flow coming in. We've talked a lot about limiting the cash flow you have going out. Now we're focusing on expanding the cash flow you have coming in, right? There's kind of 2 ways to work at that. So how could you earn a few extra dollars, right? Could you work a few extra hours? Could you pick up a spare job? Could you do a handful of things on the side? It doesn't have to be permanent, but is there something that exists that you're talented in or have skills in or can offer lessons in? I know right now, like, tutors are the most valuable thing in our economy. You know, what could you do? What could you pick up to earn a few extra dollars? I realize that can be a really tough sell, but again, hopefully not a permanent situation. So something that you just have to do for a little bit to get in the game. Yeah.
To go back, I want to go back a little bit to talking about the credit cards, and you know, I think that, and I've been in this boat before. You know, when you graduate from college, and you're getting out of the world for the first time, you get inundated with credit card offers, because I think people, you know, the credit card companies know, hey, this is a potential customer, and you accept a couple of those offers, and then you use those credit cards, and then things start to snowball. Do you see things where people are afraid to get out of debt or afraid to start tackling it because they're afraid of how deeply they actually are in debt?
Yes, absolutely. I mentioned this briefly earlier, but I've worked with clients before where we have a pretty cool tool that we use that shows, like, okay, you know, this is how much you can set aside for debt. This is exactly how long it would take you, and every monthly payment in between, which is, I think, really fun. I realize that that's not how everyone would describe fun, but the conversations that usually surround that have to do with, I never thought I could do it. I thought it was totally outside of what was even within my lifespan. I didn't realize it was doable with just a couple extra $100 a month. And I think too, when you're actually approaching it efficiently, so kind of talking about that Avalanche strategy, that is a huge game changer, because if we're, you know, and it depends, I guess, if you were someone that had only extremely high interest debt, then it has less of that trickle down effect. But generally speaking, if you tackle that highest interest one, that's saving you so much money just from the interest of it, that suddenly you have a very significant chunk to put toward the next highest interest debt. But yes, there's a lot of fear to get started. You know, people kind of accept it as a part of life. Oh, I will always be in debt. I will always have debt payments. I think as a culture, we've kind of normalized it to the point where, you know, everybody has debt. It's all good. And that makes things complicated because it doesn't build that support and that encouragement to get out of debt. And it makes sense, right? Lots of people make lots of money off those of us that do have debt, right? So they don't want to encourage us to get out of debt either. But if you're nervous, I would say, you know, if you have someone to set goals with, you know, if you've got a spouse or a family member and you're working as a team to get out of debt, that's a great person. Or just any kind of accountability partner. A financial advisor is a great person, right? that way you have someone who can work with you and say, this is how much we're contributing every month. This is what we're committing to. And this is what it looks like in the long term. I think with a lot of these things, budgeting, getting out of debt, just kind of basic financial knowledge, it feels really intimidating until you start. Because once you start to see it and start to see the impact it can have on your life, you gain momentum. It's just getting going that takes a little bit of extra effort.
And I've also, I've heard some people say, this is, friends and folks that I've known, that find themselves in debt. And one of the concerns is, I can't even get out of my own debt. How can I possibly hire a financial advisor to help me get out of debt? What do you say to somebody like that?
That's a great question. I would say there's maybe some research and some opportunity to learn more about what that process looks like. So for example, we've worked with clients that have had very significant debt, even with our highest caliber service, which is that like one-on-one with a financial advisor, personal CFO kind of thing, and had them save more money by hiring us, just because they had then a plan and they were actually executing it. So that in itself can have value. But I will also say that there are financial advising firms, ourselves included. I mean, the vast majority of what I do is I teach an online course, much of which has to do with getting out of debt. And my goal with that was to provide enough information and enough those software and the tools that I was describing to help people get out of debt with being at a much lower price point, so it's actually affordable to someone who is very concerned about getting out of debt. So there are options that exist. I know that we're not the only ones that have an online course. I'm not sure if other folks have the same like software and outlining capabilities, but that was definitely my mindset. It was built for the person who, just like you described, took on a lot of credit card debt, a car loan, some student loans, those kinds of things right after college, and just never got around to working on getting out of that, or shifting the mindset to get away from leaning on debt so hard. So we kind of build up the basics. I mean, I think the other great challenge with this is to successfully get out of debt, we have to think about the budget. We have to think about the emergency fund. Unfortunately, there are some pieces that are foundational to successfully getting out of debt. And when one of those things goes by the wayside, like oftentimes what we'll see if people don't have an emergency fund is they'll try to get out of debt, have an unexpected expense come up, and then it will set them back so much they'll kind of give up on getting out of debt and forget about it, right? And if you've got some of those foundational pieces lined up, you're more likely to be successful and to keep that momentum going. Yeah.
I think, and as you said, it's a great point to go back to that. Sometimes you will save money in the long run by hiring someone who can actually help you through the rough patches. And it's when it seems to be one of those things where when you're trying to get out of debt, you need to look past right now and look and take a longer term view.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that most people forget about really when they think about a financial advisor is they're thinking like, oh, this person's going to help me invest and build wealth in the long term. And that's absolutely true, but it's a lot more than that. Especially with money, because we don't talk about it very much as a society, and it's like kind of taboo to discuss it with your neighbor or a friend, right? We don't create any kind of accountability for ourselves, and we don't create any kind of support system. And a financial advisor's role is to step in and be that support system. So people often kind of forget that that's something that they do and they provide support for. And that's something that I've always loved that we can help with, because it's really hard. Even when you first set up a budget, it's just really hard to stick to the budget unless someone's kind of helping you and whispering in your ear to keep going, right? So I know often too, this isn't super intuitive for a lot of people, right? It's many people went through school and thought, I'm going to try to never do math again in my life, and finances are kind of the opposite of that, right? So it's great to have someone who you can kind of feel like takes that burden from you. But to your point, I mean, obviously it's going to depend on the situation and the person, but often you save a lot more money by having someone there to support you through it and actually help you follow through and successfully get out of debt. Because interest rates are high. Interest can be really expensive. And you can save, I mean, that's the other one of my favorite things about that tool is you see exactly how much interest you would have saved over the time by doing it more efficiently. And it can be very substantial depending on how much debt you have. Yeah.
Heather, thank you so much for this conversation today. It's been a lot of really great information. I want to give you an opportunity here as we move forward. I see you've got your info screen. Give us your 30-second commercial about Millennial Wealth Management and how people can reach you if they have more questions.
Absolutely. So yes, we are a Broomfield company. We're a fee-only independent financial advising company, and we have services ranging from very high touch, lots of help. Basically, you're working one-on-one with a financial advisor and they act as your personal CFO. We also have investment management services. And then for those of you, like I mentioned earlier, that maybe are just working on getting out of debt or trying to get some of those foundations set up, we have an online course designed for folks like that to walk you through the process step by step, starting with the basics. So everything, we kind of have services for everyone, regardless of where you're starting from or where you're coming from. And our goal is to help you build wealth in the long term and help teach you about finances. So I really appreciate you having me here today. I always love helping out and speaking for the chamber. It's always so fun. And I appreciate all of your questions today, Pat. It was a great questions and great conversation.
Awesome. Well, we appreciate you being a part of this education session and a part of the Chamber of Commerce. So again, Heather Venechuk with Millennial Wealth Management. You saw her contact information there. Don't be afraid to reach out if you have any other questions. Heather, again, we appreciate it. And thank you for everybody, to everybody who's watched this edition of the Broomfield Chamber Education Series. Thanks again to the Broomfield Enterprise for their webinar partnership. I'm Pat Monticelli for the Broomfield Chamber. Have a great day, everybody.